in our field, in the fertility world, clinical outcomes are extremely important. No network, no buyer wants to take on a practice that has substandard outcomes. And so we look at that very carefully. We look at personnel costs. Personnel costs are one of the biggest costs in a practice. We look at that. Marketing costs, is the marketing effective? Are you getting a payback on your marketing? Are you doing enough marketing? Are you doing too much? So all of these things feed into the equation, and that all feeds into our assessment. And we do all of that prior to being engaged by the client.
Make a couple $1 million or close up shop with nothing. That can be the stakes for single providers or small practices. For some, it might simply be too late. For others, my guests point out what you might do as a small fertility practice owner or single provider to prepare for a much better financial picture with far more and far better options during the last decade of your career. It's Bob Goodman, Richard Groberg, and Dr. Brijinder Minhas. Bob was a health system operator. Richard was the chief development officer of a clinic network, and Brijinder was an embryology lab director and fertility practice owner, among many other things for all of them. Today, all three of them work for MidCap Advisors. Richard is a recent addition, though he's done a lot of deals in the fertility space on both sides. They give us an update on the fertility mergers and acquisitions market and what the fertility clinic MSOs are doing. Did you know right now many of them are preparing to sell their networks? So they share with us what they're doing to prepare. But we tailor this conversation to the small practice owner, the single provider. We talk about when it's too late for a practice owner looking to sell, when they need to start preparing to have a successful exit, how they might be able to radically improve their sale value by going to market with one of their competitors, how MidCap has done that multiple times, and how they help competitors get their financial house in order and come together before a sell. Other factors that buyers of clinics perceive as risks that decrease the value of your practice. If you think you might sell your practice in even the next 10 years, even next 15 years, talk to any or all three of these gentlemen. There's no risk to you. MidCap doesn't charge any fees unless you have a payday. Take advantage of their knowledge. They are very patient, very knowledgeable, very consultative because they know it's a long-term relationship. They know all of this takes time. Connect with any of them through our channels. We'll have different links. Tell them you heard them on Inside Reproductive Health, or just ask me and I'll make a warm introduction for you. Whatever you do, don't put it off until it's too late. You worked hard to build a practice. Don't walk away with nothing, or don't walk away with hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars less than what you could have walked away with. The earlier you take some of these actions, the much greater return. So get in touch with MidCap and enjoy the conversation with Robert Goodman, Richard Groberg, and Brijinder Minhas.
Today's episode is paid content from our feature sponsor, who helps Inside Reproductive Health to deliver information for free to you. Here, the advertiser has editorial control. Feature sponsorship is not an endorsement and does not necessarily reflect the views of Inside Reproductive Health.
Dr. Minhas, Mr. Groberg, Mr. Goodman, Brijinder, Richard, Bob, welcome back to the Inside Reproductive Health podcast.
Thank you.
Richard, what's happening in the fertility marketplace with regards to mergers, acquisitions, deals? How does it look in the broader context of the market? How does it look and feel compared to how it may have 2 or 3 years ago?
Well, there's still significant investor interest in backing what we call the PE-backed groups. It's still a well-regarded area. Having said that, a number of the PE-backed groups seem to be positioning for sale or trade at some point this year or perhaps next year. Between that factor and thoughts about recession and interest rates are still high, there's less M&A activity than there was 2 years ago. But there's still selective groups that are very interested in strategic acquisitions, whether it fits within their existing network or it's an area that they want to be in. So that still remains fine. I will say that over time, as these PE-backed groups either merge or trade, whoever's buying them is probably not buying them to own a static business, but to buy a business that will grow. So at some point, the growth surge of M&A activity will revive again to where it was 2 and 3 years ago.
For those that are still selling, there might be less activity, but for those practices that are still being bought, are they going at similar multiples to where they were 2 or 3 years ago, or have we seen a drop?
Back in late 22 and 23, multiples started to come back to reality. This past year, for acquisitions that made sense for the buyer, in multi-doctor practices, multiples started to move back up a little bit when it made strategic sense. And since there are fewer multi-doctor practices out there anymore, the laws of supplies and demand were such that they started to trade back at premiums, not where they were in 22 and late 21, but still started to trade back up again.
For those network groups that may be going to sell, do you think you'll see them merge with each other and some will sell to each other? Or do you think that it'll simply be their private equity partners selling to some other private equity group that might not be in the space yet?
Well, if we look at the trends over the last couple of years, most of the major transactions were one group merging with another, often backed by new PE money. So I think we'll see both. The largest PE firms in the world are still looking at the fertility market, but they're also trying to rationalize where's the growth with the changing environment of fertility, with more third party payers, lower reimbursement rates, and more mandates. So I think we'll see a combination of both. But when, for example, when two groups merge, there are economies of scale at the macro level of those groups. So we'll still see some of that.
Are we waiting to see who goes first? Is that why we haven't seen too many of these networks sell yet, or at least those that have been trying to sell for a couple years? Is the marketplace trying to see who goes first and sets the stage for the multiple? What's happening there?
I think there's some of that. And I think with some deals that didn't happen last year, some of the groups are okay, let's focus on improving performance, tightening up the ship, much like MidCap does when it's working with its clients, so that when the market does start to open up again with the first transaction happening, other groups then are likely to follow. Yeah, I think that.
Bob and Brijinder, what's going on with single physician REI practices? Are they straight out of luck?
I'll take that. No, they're not straight out of luck at all. Although there are some limited opportunities in some respects. But when you look at the practices, if it's someone who's 65 or 68 years old that says maybe now I should do something, that's a little problematic. If you've got a relatively young REI who's a single practitioner in a practice, but he or she is interested in growth, looking at new opportunities, I think then we've got somebody to work with, not on an individual basis, but to look to combine them with some others who are in the same general geographic area that are of like mind. And I think that's where we have opportunity to kind of virtually bring them together and then take them to market together. One of the things that we do at MidCap when we look at combining practices is that we look for economies of scale. We look for their opportunities to reduce lab costs, reduce staffing, and just as importantly, to see if over time, if there's a way that we can improve reimbursement as well for them. So they're not out of luck, but you got to be, and they have to be a lot more open to ideas that maybe they weren't open to previously.
If I might add, I've worked on and seen a few transactions over the last couple of years, even where a PE backed group has strategic reason for acquiring a practice, either because they have enough practices and physicians in a region or in a reasonable area where they can provide the support for that practice, or they're merging it into an existing practice, closing down the smaller practices lab, and providing significant economies of scale to both the seller and the buyer in terms of both economics and work-life balance.
Is that pretty much their only option if they don't go in that route? Are they pretty much looking at hoping for luck and having a younger doc come in and buy them out, or just closing up and getting nothing? Is that pretty much the alternative if they're either not a strategic choice for a network or going to market with another group close to their area?
Well, it's bit of a mindset as well, and I think it's imperative that the single doc practices out there start thinking creatively, start thinking earlier earlier on. Yeah, I was just thinking about it a minute ago. If you're in a marketplace, you've been competitors all your lives. There comes a point when you start thinking of an exit or start thinking of a sale that it would behoove you to improve your relations with your colleagues in the marketplace. I mean, even CAP, during a lab inspection, one of the questions is, do you have a backup for your lab? So this is not just a backup for a lab, this is a backup for the practice. So I think start thinking about improving your relationships with your colleagues in your areas and start opening dialogue and start thinking about economies of scale. How can you come together? Where can you save? How can you improve the EBITDA?
Yeah, man. Griffin, we're working on a couple situations at MidCap with a physician who might be 5 years or 7 years from retirement, but a one physician practice. And if he or she doesn't find an alternative, her practice has no value at exit. And, but if that physician is willing to partner with an existing competitor, then in addition to the economies of scale, in addition to the better productivity and work life balance, instead of being worth zero, that physician is part of a combined business that's now more profitable and gets the multiple of a healthy multi-doctor practice at exit. So it can be a tremendous win-win across the board if the physicians are open. We've seen this in other industries as well, where competitors suddenly join together and then have a much better situation professionally and financially.
Yeah, we've also seen the other side of it, where there's markets where the doctors have competed against each other fiercely throughout the years, and have, it becomes very personal sometimes. And you in some cases, especially if they're, I'd say, especially if they're a little bit older, because it's gone on for much longer, it's impossible to sometimes to crack through those old issues, and to have them see sort of the light that could be attained for them. And so, they're not gonna it's not gonna work for them. And where there's an opportunity to create a wealth strategy for themselves as a result of selling their practice, it's not going to happen. So we try as hard as we can to make them see the light, but it doesn't always work.
But with age comes wisdom as well.
Let's hope.
I mean, if you let's I mean, and when you're looking at the end goal, if you can see that your competitor has a bigger lab or a better lab, and we we've got to realize that most of the cost is in the lab. Closing down one lab and functioning out of the larger lab would be better in terms of outcomes, clinical outcomes. That's why the patients come to us, is to have a baby. And secondly, it also positions both practices to exit and get a much better multiple and a much better transaction value.
Are you recommending that they merge together and become one business, or can they go to market together without having merged?
We tend to try to bring them together virtually, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is a cost. If we can virtually market them to one of the platforms, or someone else for that matter, will go through a merger, and the cost of expense for that, the legal expenses and that sort of thing, but they'll do it in effect once and not twice. And so there's some economy in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, there's a balancing act there, Griffin. If I'm a buyer and you're merging simultaneously with the transaction, then you don't know whether the cultural fit that Robert talked about will make sense and all the economies of scale are pro forma. Now, you might be able to overcome that. Whereas if they've merged and they've been working together for 3 months or 6 months, then you actually have demonstrable proof that it's working, and it's easier to then market to an acquirer.
How do you get them to get their act together to portray this possibility to a buyer? I'm picturing the three of you guys sitting two people down and saying, no, you're going to sit down and you're going to like each other and you're going to be on your best freaking behavior when these people come to meet with you. How do you do that?
Even in a fertility practice where physicians have been practicing together for a while, they don't necessarily all get along or do things the same way. But the advantage we have is we've got a lot of gray haired people who've got a lot of experience with and Brijinder and I, who've actually worked in fertility practices, sold fertility practices from both sides of the table. So we bring an insider's perspective to what needs to get done and what the pitfalls are and the landscape and what it means if you do it right. So it takes some hand holding. And yes, it takes some proper counseling. But again, we've got some gray hairs who've been there and done that.
Yeah, and my experience has less been in the fertility space in terms of being an owner and a buyer or a seller, but I've done it in other healthcare sectors throughout the years, and in many respects, it's no different. Obviously, the specifics of how does a fertility practice operate versus a diagnostic imaging center or a CT business or whatever it might be, those are obviously those different. But the dynamics of selling and the purposes behind them and everything else, all of that is largely the same.
Especially when you're dealing with physicians.
When our team goes in, we can look at it with a fresh pair of eyes. And just because you've been doing something for the past 20 years in a particular way, there are other ways to do it. And if the clinicians and the practice owners are agreeable to that, we can show them ways that eventually will help them, will improve their outcomes, and will set them on track for a good, nice transaction.
Tell me
And
about how
also,
you do that
frankly,
specifically. How do you bring two competitors who are or people who that had historically been competitors together virtually, as you say? How do you do that specifically before you bring them to potential buyers?
Well, we run what we call a process, and so what we do is we ask for a lot of data, financial data mostly, but staffing data and whatever. And so we look at that. We ask for that data using NDA and everything else associated with it from both of the practices, much as it's just two. And so as we get to understand the dynamics, the financial dynamics and everything else associated with a given practice, and we do it simultaneously with another one, that's when we can begin to say, hey, let's look at this. Maybe here are some economies, here are some things that we can do, some adjustments we can make in this practice in and of itself, and the same thing in this practice. But boy, if we can put these together, and as Brijinder has mentioned, as Richard, that we shut down a lab in one of them and that sort of thing, that's when we begin to sort of mold everything together. And at the same time, we're open with both groups, and they have NDAs between themselves as well. And so, everybody likes to hold things for as long as they can in terms of disclosure. And so we are sensitive to that, and we allow for that in the process up until a certain point in which we have to say, guys, we need to share certain things among you. And so we kind of try and do it that way.
We don't want folks to get the idea that the only way to do this, get two groups together, is to shut down the lab. No, not at all. It may be that they are miles apart in terms of just travel distances, and it's sharing of staff, sharing of responsibilities. And, the age old saying, you can't always control your revenue, but you can always control your expenses. So bringing your expenses down improves the financial picture for the combined entity. And that's what I think we can bring to the table very easily and very quickly and effectively.
When you put two practices together like that, you're no longer going to market with a one physician practice. You have multiple physicians, so you've relieved the biggest risk for a buyer of acquiring a one physician practice. I just want to make one more comment, Robert. Sorry. Is that Griffin, when two groups are actually in this discussion with us, it's because they're thinking about selling. So there's a predisposition that opens them up to possibilities that they wouldn't otherwise think of because they're thinking about selling and understand that as a one physician practice, they don't have a lot of options.
Jinder, you talked about reducing expenditures, and I'm wondering if there are expenditures that are more common among single doc groups, or they tend to maybe waste money or have to spend more money on certain things. Richard, I'm thinking of one of the first interviews I did with you, and you talked about how business owners often they'll put this expense that's really more of a personal expense on the business, and that vacation that's a business trip, they'll and it shows up as an expense, and that can affect their multiple because of how it looks with their EBITDA. Is that more common? Are there other expenditures that are more common among single doc groups?
Well, that's the case with most practices of any size, and part of MidCap or any other investment banking group working with them, the QV analysis will figure out what those are, add those back to show true profitability. I'll give you an example. There was a one doctor practice that I worked with a couple of years ago that was potentially merging into a multi-doctor practice. This one doctor practice was generating $1.5 million a year of revenues, of collections, but not profitable between their lab costs, their staff costs, their marketing, insurance, all the overhead, apart from those personal expenses. And if that practice had successfully merged into the other practice and generated the same volume, it would have probably generated $500,000 a year of profit to the combined group, because to pick up another 100 or 200 cycles, you don't need significant incremental front desk staff, nursing staff, lab staff. You might need a little bit of incremental. You combine marketing, you don't need more insurance. So all those expenses that are duplicative get saved when you're putting two groups together into one.
Are there times where you all have to have hard conversations with people because, especially if they've been competitors for a long time, they're probably thinking, my group is definitely way more or valuable than this guy's. And then you get into things and is it sometimes the case that even though they might be the similar size, that one group it just has a lot more economic value than the other, and you have to have hard conversations with folks?
I think the better question is, when do you not have to do that if you've got two competitors merging? Of course.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there is a formula. You've mentioned EBITDA a few minutes ago. And so what we try to do in terms of valuing things is say, look, combined, you guys generate $2 million in EBITDA, but $1.5 million of it comes from this group and $500,000 comes from this group. And that's how things are going to be split. As odd as that sounds in terms of that seems pretty straightforward in terms of value. That's still a difficult conversation.
You might, again, a one doctor practice that's not making much money still thinks it's worth
Right. A whole lot
much,
more.
much more than the economics. And there are some creative ways to structure that. They've got a surgery center that can be sold to a third party, non related to the business, selling off equipment. What happens to their AR? So there's a lot of creative financial engineering that we help with.
We're talking about single doc groups, but can we kind of put like two doctor groups, are they generally in the same bucket, especially if both the docs are older? Are they often in this situation? And I can think of a situation where it was a two, maybe a three doctor group and was going to sell, and there was a younger doc and who was an associate, and one of the partners was saying, yeah, I don't know if we can continue with this doc. I think we might have to part ways. And I was saying, try to avoid that at all costs, because that's probably going to be the tune of a lot of money for you with regard to multiple. Is that the case? And what advice would you have for those that are, maybe two docs, or maybe that they've got an associate, but we're not sure if this is working out? Do they need to make it work out?
I'd say for the most part, yeah, they probably do, because one of the biggest concerns I think that any of the buyers have is, who's going to take over this practice in 2 years or 3 years or whatever? And we got to transition it over even before that. And if you bring to the table somebody, you, the seller, bring that person to the table, that adds value. And I think you said that before yourself. And if you don't have that, it's not a showstopper. It just makes the transaction that much harder at the end of the day, because the recruitment becomes a big factor. And as you know, as we all know, the number of REIs that are available is somewhat limited. And despite the fact that OBGYNs or GYMs are coming into the mix and providing certain services, they're not REIs, and they can add value up to a point, and some add value fully, but they're still not necessarily board certified REIs with most
I
folks.
can tell you from 2 doctor practices to 4 doctor practices, from when I was selling practices to having recently been on the buy side, if the transaction itself is not taking care of and locking in the younger physicians, the buyers either are going to pay a lower valuation because they're going to take care of the lower physicians or require you to. And I've seen a lot of transactions recently where the buyers have required the seller to give some of the rollover equity or bonuses to the younger physicians, vesting over time to lock them in. Again, otherwise, you're buying something where your principal asset is getting ready to retire and leave after cashing out. So it's important to be able to lock in the next generation of leadership.
Brijinder, what's the timing that doctors should begin to think about this? Because I think you'd said a bit further out. I think people often think, well, I'm not going to retire soon, but to them, they think I'm not going to retire within 2 years. And so therefore, I don't need to think about it. But it's further out that they need to start thinking about this, isn't it?
I would say if the thought process is that you want to retire at 60, between 65 and 70, you should start this process or start talking to folks or get your house in gear. I'd say start at 55
So that's a lot of time in advance. Why so much time?
because it takes time. It takes time to get your mind tuned into the whole concept of, suddenly I'm going to be working with other people. I'm going to have to be more mindful of colleagues. I'm not going to be calling all the shots. And if you've been doing that all your life, it takes time to get that mindset ready. Even in a situation where the physicians have a reasonably long runway, the buyers want 5-year contracts, you know. And if the employment contract is any less, like it's 3 years, the valuation goes down. So
How do people react to this idea when you talk to them about it? You've worked with a lot of different fertility doctors in big markets, and maybe they're a single doc group, but there's a couple other single doc groups in that market. When you talk to them about the idea of maybe we should also try to find someone else for you to go to market with, are they familiar with this idea typically? Have they thought about it in depth typically by the time you've talked to them? Or are you dropping a bomb on them that they've hardly considered?
it works both ways, but I think all three of us have been having conversations, and in fact, Scott as well, conversations in the field. And slowly, I think it's catching on. It's not that much of a bombshell. I think folks are coming to the realization that this is probably one of the best ways that they are going to achieve their goal.
Yeah, we've been for the last few years doing email blasts pre ASRM, even pre MRSI, and especially the ones pre ASRM. We try and talk about different topics, and we always talk about one of them, the single doc practices, and the things to look for and the things to think about. And so we've been trying to plant that seed, others too. I mean, certainly not just us, and so I think to Brijinder's point, we try and get that out there. And even in the podcast, Griffin, that you did with Brijinder and I last year, we had some discussion about this as well. So we really try and point this stuff out as early as possible, that they should consider these combinations as well as other physician recruitment for themselves as early as possible. It's daunting to consider a single doc practice hiring another REI. It's very expensive, and they don't typically have the resources to do it. And so we try to soften the blow by at least hopefully having these people read about it and think about it.
The closer they are to retirement, Griffin, or the closer they are to thinking about retirement, the more receptive they become to this idea. And I've seen this in other areas of healthcare, because if you're 10 years from retirement, the thought of partnering with your competitor isn't attractive. But if you're thinking about it and it's getting closer to reality, and you see that you've got no alternative other than perhaps bringing in a junior partner who's going to cost you money up front and wants their equity for next to nothing, they become more and more receptive to the concept because there are fewer alternative scenarios.
Right. Because the alternative, if they don't do any of those things, is close up shop and sell somebody your chart or something like that. And, you'll get $14. And that's about it.
Yeah, that was going to be my question, Bob. Do you meet with people sometimes and you're just like, I'm sorry, it's too late. I can't help you. Does that ever happen?
It's happened. It's happened to me. Even prior to coming to MidCap, I spent some time working in the dental roll up space, and I definitely found it there, where there were single dentist practices out of their homes, that sort of thing. We've all seen those, and maybe we've even gone to those kinds of docs. They're 65, 68 years old, and it's like, okay, I'm ready to go. Now what do I do? The ship has sailed.
Yeah, donate your equipment to a medical brigade going down to South America. That's pretty much what you can do it at this point. How far apart can clinics be and still do this strategy? Like, do they have to be within 50 miles of each other? Can a clinic in Cleveland do this with a clinic in Detroit, or do they have to be much closer typically?
The geography is different. If you live in New York City or LA or Chicago, 10 miles is a lifetime. But in other areas where, again, I've seen situations like Brijinder mentioned before, where they're far enough away that the labs make sense to stay open. But if one practice has 3 physicians and it's an hour and a half drive, then you suddenly have physician support so that a one doctor practice, he or she can take a vacation. If they've got a big batch, they've got help with it. And there are some economies of scale. So every situation is unique. And sometimes it makes sense to merge them. And sometimes there are enough economies of scale without merging and closing facilities that it still works.
You guys, MidCap has a reputation for being very helpful. From my experience, you all are very patient. Sometimes I feel like too patient. Like I want to come in and tell them, like, hey, wrap this up, move stuff along. But you all have this reputation for coming in and helping people, even if they're not quite sure if they're going to sell, if they're saying, oh, well, maybe we'll think about it in a year or two. You all have this sort of MO about earning the business and just building relationships. And so I've seen it where you all have come in and helped people with different things, even though they might not be engaged with you or they might not be selling their practice right now. Why do you do that?
Well, I've been at MidCap the longest, so maybe I can answer that a little bit. It's a little bit of the philosophy within MidCap to do that. The healthcare vertical within MidCap is just one of the verticals, and MidCap's been around a lot longer than the healthcare vertical. And so I think some of it comes out of the philosophy of the original founders, and some of it I think comes out of our other managing director who's been there longer than I have, Scott Yoder. And obviously I know you know him, and hopefully the audience that is listening to this knows Scott as well. So it comes out of him as well. And I think it's done him well during his years as a banker. I think I think it's the right way to go, because this selling your practice is like selling your child, and so
Very emotional.
it's a very emotional sort of thing. It's not just. I mean, there are a lot of people that are definitely dollars and cents focused, and that's it. People in the fertility space are way more emotional about things, I'd say, than some other areas. So it just takes time for people to really get comfortable with the idea of doing this. And now, that being said, do we try and push hard at different times? Of course we do. because it's sooner or later, we want to get a transaction done and we want to be compensated, because the approach that we take is that we only get paid when a deal closes. And so we try to make sure that the folks that we connect with are of the right mindset. They have the business quality as well as the financial quality that will ultimately yield a good result for us. But we've got to push them along sometimes. But it does take time, and I think people do appreciate that.
There's another reason why it's important to build the relationship. Selling a healthcare practice is not like you sell your home and the day it closes, you move out. Okay. In this case, when you sell a healthcare practice, in most cases, the next morning, you wake up and go back to work. But now you're not the landlord who owns your practice. You have a partner that paid a lot of money to buy your practice. There are some things that are going to change, and you have to coexist. So it's not just the dollars and cents of the deal. It's also finding the right partner and the working relationship and subtleties in the terms. And I've talked about this in some of my past podcasts with you. And the fact that we've got people with significant healthcare experience, and Brijinder and I have been in the industry. Having those relationships formed over time helps work the sellers through this very complicated, once in a lifetime process. That's not just, I'm selling my house and I'm moving out tomorrow and I never have to deal with this again.
What do you do when you come in and it's your incentives, your interests are very aligned with the practice owner, because you're not taking some sort of retainer engagement up front. You're getting paid when they get paid. So it's in your interest to make sure that they have a healthy business. What are you doing in those times before they're ready to sell to get them prepared for whatever option they might choose in the future?
It really depends on the individual situation, the needs of the practice. I mean, we look at it with multiple eyes, and we look at every aspect of the practice. We get a lot of data, financial data, clinical data, and then come up with a so-called composite picture, a composite evaluation. And sometimes, and we've experienced this, the time is not right. All three of us have seen it, where we say, well, I think you need to wait 6 months or wait a year, or this needs to be fixed, or this needs to be fixed, this needs to be fixed, to be in a much better situation.
And sometimes those same people, as Virginia's referring to, they've already set some plans in motion for growth. And so we encourage them to continue those activities, and let's see how that growth plays out. Because if it does play out in the way that they think it plays out, that just puts them in a better position, puts us in a better position to help them as well.
Yeah, and Griffin, if you go back to my selling a house analogy, before a practice actually goes to market, that significant work we do is like, again, when you're selling a house, you don't just put it on the market. Someone comes in and sees where there are nicks or cracks or things that need to be cleaned up or touched up or improved, or something, we need to wait 6 months until the market's better in order to do something. But unlike some of the other groups in the industry that represent sellers, we actually have experience in the industry and can roll up our sleeves and work with those practices to position them at the right time and with the right, again, cleanup and modifications and posturing.
Yeah, and I've been talking at various conferences over the years on behalf of MidCap, and always talking about getting your house in order. And typically, we are using selling your house as an example. And in some cases, it's changing out furniture or bringing the landscaper in to make some changes outside, or whatever it might be. But some of it's cosmetic, and a lot of it's not. Richard talked about things that are not cosmetic. Although maybe a little bit, but some of it's not cosmetic. Some of it's like you should get that radon test done maybe beforehand or something like that to see if you've got a problem.
What specific advice would each of you give to practice owners?
Every situation is unique. It's just like a fertility doctor can't prescribe the treatment for a patient without blood tests and lab tests and consultation and a diagnosis. And that's part of what we do is we've got to diagnose the practice, and then those specific recommendations are custom designed and tailored by analyzing each practice, discussion with the owners, and our understanding of the markets and who potential buyers are,
Right.
what they're looking for.
If you've seen one practice, you've seen one practice. They're not all the same. There's obviously a lot of similarity. So, and we all draw from our experiences, and whether they're from the fertility space or working with dentists and ophthalmologists and others where I've dealt with from time to time in the past, or surgery centers, whatever it might be. There's so many things that you can draw from and try to work with these folks on. And we have the credibility, we have the experience. I've sold four. I've been involved with four businesses and have successfully sold at least two of them. And I mean personally. So we've been there. We've been C-suite guys in large healthcare businesses and other places. So we think we have credibility. Gray hair goes along with it.
Just a couple of points. Griffin, you ask a very important question. In our field, in the fertility world, clinical outcomes are extremely important. No network, no buyer wants to take on a practice that has substandard outcomes. And so we look at that very carefully. We look at personnel costs. Personnel costs are one of the biggest costs in a practice. We look at that. Marketing costs, is the marketing effective? Are you getting a payback on your marketing? Are you
Or are
doing
you doing enough?
Are
They
you
may not
doing
be
enough
doing
marketing?
enough.
Are you doing too much?
Well,
So all of these things feed into the equation, and that all feeds into our assessment. And we do all of that prior to being engaged by the client.
Yeah, and we've had a lot of experience with a lot of practices, and now with Richard on board, I know we're going to be able to hone this even more. And although we don't try to always talk about this, we have a body of data that says this is what we typically see as the percentage of revenues that you're spending on marketing, and we see some people spend way above that. We see some people spend way below that. I'm just using that as one example. And so, we try to understand what they're trying to accomplish with whatever it is they're doing and say to them, how is it working? And how are you judging whether it's working or not? In some cases, we find out, oh yeah, we do all this stuff and blah, blah, blah. But so, and how do you track it? Oh, I don't think we do track it. So there's a lot of things that we try to help them with.
I hope that people take advantage of this and get in touch with you. I hope they do so before it's too late. I hope they do so as they're starting to think about things and not further down the line when you could have helped them even more. We'll be putting your different ways of being able to contact you in different places, and people can always ask me for an introduction. But I consider myself to be someone that's pretty middle of the road, pleasantly persistent when it comes to sales. You all are so much more laid back than I am, and so you're all easy to talk to. Anybody that I've introduced you to has been happy that they've had a chance to talk to you, and it's just an easy, very, very low risk. I hope that some people take advantage of you. A lot of people already have. And I look forward to having all three of you back on the Inside Reproductive Health podcast. Thanks for coming on, gentlemen.
Today's episode is paid content from our feature sponsor, who helps Inside Reproductive Health to deliver information for free to you. Here, the advertiser has editorial control. Feature sponsorship is not an endorsement and does not necessarily reflect the views of Inside Reproductive Health. Thank you for listening to Inside Reproductive Health.